the whole notion that a lack of charging infrastructure is responsible for slow adoption of electric vehicles by commercial fleets is a total red herring. Fleet electrification is actually easy and predictable when done right, and charging is not the barrier most fleets think it is.
Your trusted source for information on the energy transition. This is the Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. Welcome to another edition of the Insider's Guide to Energy EV series. I'm your host, Chris Sass. With me is Niall, Riddell. And today we have with us Josh Green, CEO of Inspiration Mobility Group. Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Chris. Niall, great to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. I think it makes sense to always start and tell our audience a little bit about what it is you guys do and what's Inspiration Mobility Group.
Yeah, sounds great. So Inspiration Mobility Group is an electrification accelerator. And what that means is that we are an integrated provider of fleet and charging solutions, all designed to simplify and accelerate the transition to electric transportation in North America. So we have the world's first eFMC, which is an EV first fleet management company, alongside a turnkey developer of commercial grade charging solutions. And together, those two businesses are really making a difference in accelerating the electrification of commercial transportation and fleets. And we solve all their problems, reduce risk, reduce costs, and make it a very easy thing to in-fleet electric vehicles.
So this is super exciting, finding a dedicated electric vehicle fleet management company, but is the market actually big enough for this?
Yeah, in fact, we think the market is enormous for this. The time is right for an eFMC to help fleets because interest in going electric has never been higher. Partly driven by emerging regulation in states like California, New York, Massachusetts. The EVs are beginning to be required in certain types of fleets, but also being driven by the state of electric vehicles and the costs, the lower operating costs, the maturity of the technology. Many fleets have committed to going electric for those reasons or for sustainability reasons. And so we see an enormous uptick in interest in going electric. And the commercial vehicle market is a lot larger than most people think. So in the US, the commercial vehicle market ranges from, you see estimates ranging from 9 million commercial vehicles on the streets to 19 million. Very large number of vehicles, every type of asset class you can think of. If you kind of look out the window and on the street, many more commercial vehicles than you might realize when you start seeing branded vans going by, last mile delivery, flower delivery, service fleets like mechanical contractors and pest control companies. And then you've got heavy duty fleets, Class 8 tractors that are on the highways. You've got taxis, rideshare vehicles. So it is an enormous opportunity both to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which transportation accounts for roughly a third of our greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., and to have an impact on fleet operating costs and safety. And so we see it as an enormous opportunity right now.
Help me understand, is fleet management has been around forever. Fleets have been around a long time. You just described the size of it. It's a huge market. Why the need for an eFMC or electronic fleet management? Why isn't just become an extension of the fleet management that's already in place? Because there's a lot of folks that have jobs running fleets, and there's a lot of software already. Lots of money in this space already. How come we need new software to do this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't categorize it as new software because it's actually an entirely new business model and value chain for an electric vehicle. So let's go back and look at what we call legacy FMCs. So the legacy fleet management companies that exist today. Many of these companies have been around for decades. I think the first one was launched probably about 100 years ago. And these are companies that effectively do, in some ways, business process outsourcing, right, for companies that have take-home sales fleets. They have van fleets to deliver goods and services. Those companies don't want to own their vehicles typically. They treat the vehicle in the same way they might treat a computer for an employee or a cell phone. It's an employee tool, right? It's a tool for the employee to do the job. But those FMCs, which lease vehicles and provide services like maintenance and title and registration and accident management, those FMCs have been optimized over decades around the internal combustion engine. So what does that mean? That means that, first off, 50 to 60% of their revenues come from services, not from leasing the vehicle, but from services that attach to the vehicle. And over 50% of those services are directly tied to the internal combustion engine. Think of the two most prominent being maintenance, oil changes, and other maintenance on the engine itself, as well as fuel. And so those FMCs take a cut of every time a fleet driver is filling up the gas tank, they're taking a cut of that. And so it's a huge part of their revenue. Similarly, their financing models in terms of how they purchase and finance and lease vehicles have all been optimized around the internal combustion engine, where residual values are very statistically known and at this point understood, and where there are no complications coming from, for example, a federal tax credit that is available only on electric vehicles. And then you add in charging, right? Charging is in some ways the linchpin of a successful electrification effort, and fleet management companies have never had to deal with the fueling of the vehicle beyond providing a fuel card for someone to pull into a Shell or BP or Exxon station. Fueling has been, for all intents and purposes, a public good. The driver drives off and they can fuel up anywhere. Now charging is something that, for a commercial fleet to electrify, they have to understand. In many cases, they have to put it in themselves. Fleet management companies were not built to do that. They don't understand it well. They typically outsource to one provider. Their ability to really design and implement custom solutions that fleets need is very limited. So from day one, we set out to build a different type of fleet management company, an eFMC, specifically built to maximize the benefits of the electric vehicle and reduce the risks. And so that combines charging, it combines tax credit subsidized leasing, it combines services that help vehicles charge at home and know when to charge and where to charge. And so it's all built on a modern tech platform, which is very different than the traditional legacy FMCs, which are mostly running off of AS400 mainframes from the 70s. And so for all those reasons, we've rapidly established that if you're serious about going electric, you really need an eFMC to help you.
So when you introduced the size of the fleet market, you talked about cost. And as you run through some of the specific characteristics of your eFMC capability, we've talked a little bit about some of those elements that contribute to what fleet managers look at, total cost of ownership. How are you helping them get that TCO model really optimized to get them value so that they can make that transition as quickly as possible?
Yeah, great question. And it's one of the first things we do when we're talking to a fleet. So many fleets, we kind of categorize fleets. They're in different stages of what we call their electrification journey, right? There are fleets that are what I would call EV curious, right? They don't yet have an electric vehicle. They've heard about this electrification thing. They think maybe it would work. Maybe the fleet manager is getting some pressure from senior management to do something to reduce emissions, but they really are starting from scratch. And the main question they're asking is, will an electric vehicle work for me? Full stop. There are other companies that have tried electric vehicles, have had either some success, some failures. In many cases, they've done a pilot, but it stopped there. For them, they are saying, well, okay, electrification has worked in some capacity. Will it work for the rest of my fleet? How can I go faster? And so in all those cases, Neil, we often begin our engagement with the customer with something we call an EV opportunity assessment. And that is a free assessment. It's a free tool we do to first engage the fleet and say, let's give us your fleet data. Let us understand what types of assets you have, what types of routes they drive, how many hours does it sit, and is it on the road? So kind of the duty cycle, where it lives at night. And we will come back to you with analysis that says, of your entire fleet of 50 vehicles or 50,000 vehicles, here are the ones where EVs make sense today. And we do that primarily based on three different factors. One, there is an EV available with the right range, the right payload, and in fact, the right climate adjusted range, payload adjusted range, to do the job that you need done, and that you're doing with that ICE vehicle. That's number one. Number two is cost. By adopting that EV and putting it into the fleet in lieu of that ICE vehicle, will it save you money? Will it be, as you said, Neil, TCO at least neutral? Ideally, it's saving money relative to the internal combustion engine vehicle. And third, is the right charging solution knowable and easy to install? And do we know the costs, the rough costs? So can we include those in the TCO analysis and show the right and complete TCO analysis? So we run those three tests basically on every vehicle in the fleet, and we quickly identify the ones, here are the ones that really should be electric today. For those vehicles, you are losing money every day you're driving an ICE vehicle on that route. And it's something, it's usually a pretty powerful analysis and visualization for fleets, because whereas they may come in saying, I think this maybe 3% of my fleet could be electric, we often leave saying, well, actually 50% of your fleet could be electric today, and let us, as a next step, we'll plan for when you might electrify the rest of those, but here's what you should be doing today and what's achievable. And we always say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We see a lot of fleet managers who are kind of sitting on their hands, and they seem to be saying, I will engage with electrification when it can electrify every vehicle in my fleet. And we say, look, there are plenty of vehicles where EVs work today, where they'll save you money, they're safer, they're better driver experience. Do what you can do, and let us identify the constraints on those other vehicles and work on those over time to get you to a fully electric fleet over a number of years.
Josh, one of the things we see here in the UK is a real collapse in the residual value of vehicles. Is that something you're experiencing, and how do you treat it? What are the risks that it means for your business, or what are the risks it means for the fleets that you work with?
Yeah, good question. So we talk a lot about residual values, and the first thing that I usually say is that when people start talking about residual values, for the most part, they're talking about light duty vehicles. So when we look at commercial fleets, we usually segment a little bit the mechanics and data between light duty vehicles, medium duty, and heavy duty. The light duty vehicles is where there's the longest track record, right? Largely starting with Tesla. But now we have years with many models, makes and models on the road. And that is where I think that's certainly what the general press writes about as well, is kind of the light duty vehicles and residual values falling. We get asked about that a lot. I usually start with two things. One is that I think we are past a unique and unprecedented time in residual value volatility for electric vehicles. And I say that because over the last few years, those residual values did have a substantial collapse, but largely driven by two factors. One was the somewhat surprising and one might say random price movements of one manufacturer, Tesla, who for a long time was really the only manufacturer at scale of light duty proven electric vehicles. And so there was a time of unprecedented run-ups in those prices where they twice or three times adjusted pricing up on the Tesla Model Y, the Tesla Model 3. The Tesla Model Y at one point was selling for in the $60,000 range and above. And then soon thereafter, as more makes and models came out in terms of there being a wider array of EVs and other OEMs ramped up production, Tesla pretty rapidly cut its prices another 2 or 3 times. And so that kind of one-time up and down is something that we don't expect to see again. It's something that was really, I think, a one-time event. They took advantage of the fact that they were alone in the market, and now they have to compete. And so price movements over the last, call it 18 months, 2 years, have been significantly lower in terms of adjusting that new car purchase price. The second thing that's happened is obviously Hertz, the disposition of the Hertz inventory, where they bought 100,000 EVs and then had to pretty quickly dump them into the market, that has had a big impact. And we don't really see that happening again either. They were by far the largest purchaser of EVs for a period of time. And then all of a sudden they flooded the market with a lot of used vehicles. So we're kind of beginning to get past that. Our head of fleet operations here at Inspiration, who tracks all of these things, says that EV residual values are beginning to become more predictable and get back into a normal cycle. And so for our business, it has had very little impact. Partly that's because most of the leases we do are what's known as a track lease, where our customer bears that residual value risk. But it certainly, we know many companies that did get caught out, that had a closed-end lease where they held on to that residual value risk and were banking on it being a certain amount, and then it was a lot less than they thought. But the other thing I would say is that for most commercial fleets, not every, but for most commercial fleets, they utilize vehicles for generally a longer period of time, so 4, 5, 6 years. For light-duty vehicles, it's usually 4 or 5. In that time period, we think residual values will revert to being somewhat predictable. So many of them, even if the actual carrying cost of the vehicle today, the fair market value of the vehicle today, would be lower than where they thought it would be, or where we thought it would be when we wrote the lease. By the end of the lease, we think those things will catch up and they'll be, more or less where it should be. So those residual values tend to normalize over time. A large and growing supply of used EVs at affordable prices is a great thing for the market. It's great for consumers. It's also great for our customers who are looking at, some of the customers that we work with will take a used EV, a lightly used EV, and they can take advantage, therefore, of a lower cost of entry to get into an EV. And that just makes that TCO, that total cost of ownership analysis we talked about earlier, of an EV relative to an ICE vehicle, all that much better for the EV. So we think it's a great thing that EVs are becoming more affordable generally.
So do you see the cost as a key barrier to fleet electrification, or is it something else that sits in the way of us transitioning faster into commercial electric vehicles?
Yeah, well, that really gets at the heart of why we started the company, right? Back in 2020 and 2021, we started in the very beginning of 2021, and I started thinking about this idea in 2020. And at the time, I looked around and said, well, commercial vehicle technology for electric vehicles has hit the point at which there's no longer appreciable technology risk. Like the batteries have proven, again, largely on the back of Tesla over a decade, that the EV is simply a better vehicle in many applications if you get all the pieces right. So I looked around and said, well, why are more vehicles on the streets not electric? And it came down to two factors. One is the higher upfront cost. So as you mentioned, EVs today typically still have a cost delta in the upfront cost relative to an equivalent ICE vehicle. The second issue is charging. So there is a perception that charging is complex, that it takes a lot of time, that maybe it's more expensive to put in. And even if you can disprove those points of view, there's still way too few fleet managers, in fact, I'd say very few, who come out of an energy background and can understand charging and without doing substantial research and education. And so I think those were the two factors. It was a higher upfront cost, and wow, there's this whole new discipline I need to learn to understand how to fuel these vehicles, and that seems difficult. It seems complex, and that's frankly why we launched the company, which was to bring under one roof people who come out of both fleet and energy, so we can provide an integrated solution, and to solve the higher upfront cost issue, partly by monetizing every incentive available. So that includes the 45W federal tax credit in the United States for an electric vehicle. It includes every type of incentive. Different states have tax credits, different cities have incentives and subsidies and rebates, different OEMs have rebates. So how do we take advantage of all those, make sure the customer gets the benefit of every available incentive? And how do we make charging a non-factor? How do we make it so easy that it feels the same as throwing the keys to the driver and letting them find the nearest, Exxon or Mobil station? So that's what we set out to do, and I think that higher upfront cost is still a perceived barrier, but I think rapidly becoming a non-issue, particularly with commercial fleets, which are sophisticated enough to do the total cost of ownership and think about the total life cycle of the vehicle over multiple years, as opposed to just what's my monthly payment.
Do fleets want to stick their toe in the water, and is that possible to get the economies of scale? So, do I buy just a couple of EVs and have, let's say, my high driving salespeople drive them for a little bit, or some people in the company? And does that model really pan out, or is it better just to dive in and go big and hope for the best?
Well, I definitely would not encourage anybody to hope for the best. This is a complex undertaking, and we call ourselves a systems integrator, because one of the things you have to do is get all the pieces right. You have to pick the right vehicle for the right route and duty cycle. You've got to find the right charging. You don't want to be relying on public charging. That we always call that the option of last resort for commercial fleets. So let's take hope for the best off the table. That is not a good strategy, I think. Hope is not a strategy, as they say. Where we typically start is, as I mentioned, that EV opportunity assessment. And as I said, that often identifies many more vehicles than the fleet manager was thinking. They were thinking, oh, maybe I'll try a pilot of 40 vehicles. And we say, well, actually, 500 of your vehicles could be electric, or should be electric. And then usually what we see, Chris, is that the first orders and the first adoption is somewhere between those two numbers, right? They don't go all in and go 500 day one. But I think more and more companies are saying, well, let's do what we can do. Like, we need to get drivers used to it. We need to get our internal, depots used to it, where they're going to park. If many of those vehicles are, as you mentioned, sales vehicles that go home with an employee at night, we got to get a charger in the employee home, or find an alternative to that, which we can help them with. So it is definitely not advisable to just kind of go all in and do every vehicle or try it all at once.
But let me quantify a little bit. What are some milestones maybe that you would set up? So if you come in and say, okay, great, we got these 40 vehicles, we're going to put them online. You potentially have 500 vehicles in your fleet that could be electrified. What are the kind of milestones you recommend to a client to look at and say, okay, well, here we did this, so you should be comfortable enough to move to this point. What are some of those things that folks look at as a tipping point to really go further in? Yeah,
I'll give a few examples. I mean, the first thing is, the very first wave of EVs for many fleets these days is driven by compliance, right? Compliance with emerging California regulations, advanced clean fleets, and regulation that's pending in a bunch of other states that have said they're going to adopt the California standards. So that is number one. Like we are working with companies where next year, starting January 1st, 2025, they have to have 10% of their eligible vehicles, certain vehicle classes, electric. And they get fined if those vehicles are not electric. And so that's number one, is let's identify those and make sure we get those transitioned on time. Second is, part of the point of the EV opportunity assessment is identifying what we call kind of the no-brainers, right? These are the easy ones. These are the ones where they can comfortably do the job. Charging is easy to install, so we're not going to encounter headaches on that or surprises. And we help them select literally the driver that drives a certain route, that hauls a certain amount of payload, to make sure that those drivers have the best possible experience. So I think we are trying to get them to go as fast as possible, but never having a hiccup. And that involves staging it. There's a big part of this that we call change management, right? Which is getting the drivers used to driving an EV, getting around range anxiety, so to speak. So I'm not sure I can give you a roadmap specifically, because what we say is every fleet is a snowflake, right? Every fleet is different, and we have to design that with the fleet manager. But I think what we're looking for are the easy wins, the obvious wins, where you're going to have a great experience, And that's everything from identifying some of the drivers that want them to start with. Now, we have fleet managers who actually, I'll say two more comments on this. We have fleet managers that actually want to try a number of different types of assets. So they say, all right, I want to do 25 light duty. I want to do 25 cargo vans. I want to do 25 of the medium duty, like box trucks, because I actually want to get experience with all those. And we've had some fleet managers say, I don't actually want to start only with drivers that say in a survey they want an EV. I wanted to have half that do and half that don't, because again, I want to get experience with how, can I overcome objections from somebody who maybe isn't, opting in at first blush to an EV. So we help them design that strategy. Every fleet's different. But the fundamental point is, let's make sure they have an excellent experience all the way through, so that we address those sometimes perceived fears that aren't real.
So this for me is quite interesting, because we're starting to see blockers in some UK fleets who've adopted early commercial vehicles, and they're now getting into what we're describing as maybe the harder to treat vehicles. Often we get statements like vans are the poor cousins of the car. It's easy to do your car fleet conversion. It's harder to do your van fleet conversion. Do you see the automotive manufacturers doing enough to bring makes and models and vehicle types to market?
Yeah, well, I think that is a great example with the cargo vans in particular. I think, as I mentioned before, talking about fleet vehicles, there's a massive diversity of vehicle and use case within commercial fleets, right? Everything from, again, Class 8, like drayage trucks, taking goods from ports, to taxis and rideshare vehicles and everything in between. So on the light duty side, there's now a very wide selection of makes, models, price points, ranges, form factors. We see in cargo vans for a while, there was one manufacturer, really. It was the 4D Transit. And now this year, there's 4 or 5 different variants, and that range from the, what I would call light duty van to more of a medium duty van. And so I think the product proliferation is now out there where most fleets that operate those types of vehicles can at least substitute a wide variety of their ICE vehicles for EVs with no disruption whatsoever. I think on the heavy duty side, there's still very limited production. So that is one area that I think still vehicle selection, availability, and definitely vehicle price, at least in the US, is limiting adoption. And where I think OEMs still can do more in terms of ramping up production, lowering prices. But I do think that there's always, as you said, Neil, there's always easy to electrify parts of the fleet and harder to electrify parts. I don't typically distinguish between those being necessarily the asset type. So I'm not sure it's harder to electrify a cargo van than a passenger car just because it's a cargo van. I think it has to do with, again, the use case and where it goes and how far it's driven. But the OEMs, I think, that are doing a pretty good job now of ramping production and adding supply of vehicles that have different levels of batteries and price points.
So a conversation like this is not complete if we don't talk a bit about charging. You've mentioned it a couple of times as we've gone through this call. We talked about where public charging is maybe not the desirable outcome for a fleet operator, and therefore, there are certain solutions that are in place in the marketplace. What do you do to support your customers with charging? Do you focus 100% on depot? Do you look at home charging? How do you manage some of that complexity for your customers?
Yeah, I think it's an important differentiator actually for us. I think we are alone in the market, frankly, in terms of offering a comprehensive charging solution that can cover every vehicle and every engagement model with the fleet. And what I mean by that is, let's start with the charging type, right? As we talked about, most fleets are either using level 2 overnight charging, so the vehicle resides long enough, 8 hours, 10 hours, at an overnight charger, and it does not need a top-up during the day, right? That overnight charge is sufficient for its duty cycle during the day. Then level 3 chargers are higher speed chargers that you need for either much bigger batteries or duty cycles where you need, they're going too far to fulfill the total daily driving on one charge, and so they need top-ups during the day. We can do any of that, and we can do it wherever it makes sense. And so what I mean by that is there are take-home vehicles where we can install a level 2 charger at an employee home. We can electrify a company depot where the vehicles reside today. Although there are challenges there often, depending on, one, whether the company owns or leases that property, and two, how easy it is to get the power and to install those chargers. We can also match them with an offsite depot. So we have a pretty comprehensive list of offsite charging depots being built around the country and ones that are already operating. And if one of our fleets happens to have a bunch of drivers nearby one of those depots that's either available or coming online, we can help them reserve capacity and make sure their vehicles have a home. We also offer something that we call a multi-fleet charging hub. Our name for that is, we call it a power-up point, where actually for some of our customers, we can build on their property a high-speed charging depot to both charge their vehicles, and then when their vehicles aren't using it, to offer that charging to other vehicles in the community and other fleets in the community. And it takes charging from a pure cost center for the fleet to actually a revenue generator, because they're offering that charging infrastructure to others. And so that's something we do with fleets as well. Again, depends on land availability and location and the fleet need. But we are really the only ones that span the waterfront there and will implement the custom solution. And last thing I'll say on that is the engagement model itself matters. Some fleets say, I'm going to own this infrastructure. It's at my site, but I don't want to pay for it. So I'd like you to help me pay for it. Others say, you know what? I don't want to touch it. I don't know enough. Can you do what's called charging as a service? And I'll sign a fuel contract. Back to your point, Chris, about fuel prices. I'll sign a fuel contract that says I'm going to pay you this much per year for fuel, but you build, own, operate it, finance it, and we do that as well. And that can vary by location within a complex fleet.
We've covered a lot of material in a short period of time. We've gone everywhere from the vehicles and market adoption to charging. Josh, this has been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, guys. Always enjoyed talking about this and enjoyed the good questions.
For our audience who enjoy Insider's Guide to Energy EV series, we encourage the dialogue to continue in the chat. Follow us on our YouTube channel, subscribe, and add comments, like it, share it with your friends, and we'll see you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy EV. Bye for now.